Welcome to the Galactic Collaboration Summit, boldly going where no conference has gone before. My name is Marc Anderson, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Microsoft 365 Community Docs. I'm the president of some Praxis Consulting outside Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, and I'm a SharePoint MVP, or I guess Office Apps and Services MVP. In fact, I've been working in this space for probably longer than anyone should remember. It's probably been closer to 40 years doing technology professional services and development and other techie stuff, as well as some management consulting. So one of the things that I've always had a lot of interest in is how we can make people more effective in their jobs. And technology is often one of the tools that we use. And how can we make people effective in using those technologies? And that's really what the Microsoft 365 community content is all about. And I'm going to talk about that today and let you know a little bit about it and what it might be useful for you, as well as ways you can contribute in order to make the repository even more powerful than it's been up till now. So if you'd like to go and visit the Microsoft 365 Community Docs, there's an aka.ms link on the screen that you can use if you'd like to follow along or if you'd like to run ahead as I'm talking. Of course, every project has to have a mascot, and I was thinking about what animal has not been used yet by some technology company or software group or Microsoft product team or whatever. And you know, I haven't seen a lot of walruses out there, so I found myself a nice little walrus mascot. If you go and follow our Twitter account, which is M365ComDocs, you'll see that walrus is the avatar of the project. And it also stands out quite nicely in a Twitter stream. So what are these Microsoft 365 Community Docs anyway? Well, it's a relatively new initiative. It's been going on for about a year, but things like this do take a little bit of time to sort of pick up speed. We had to navigate some, discussions and political thoughts and things like that, and sort of come up with the merit for the effort in the first place. It was really the brainchild of Vesa Juvonen, man of many talents, and we talked probably well over a year ago about creating a repository that is useful for people who sort of fit in this middle ground that I've always been very interested in. We've got a lot of open source efforts under the P&P, Patterns and Practices umbrella, as well as some fantastic documentation that comes from Microsoft itself, plus a lot of very powerful content coming from people out in the community, which is published on people's blogs, in discussion groups, on the Microsoft tech community, all kinds of different places. And what we wanted to really do was start to bring some of that content together to help people like information architects, business analysts, so-called makers, sometimes have been called in the past citizen developers, and site owners who really just want to use the Microsoft 365 platform better. There's a lot to this platform. Sometimes we sort of, especially those of us who have been in the space for a while, we think about things from the part of the platform from which we came. So for instance, I'm a SharePoint guy from way back. So I tend to think about things with a SharePoint lens. People who are Exchange administrators think about it from an Exchange lens. But Microsoft 365 has so many different services that can be used in different ways together, and together is the key word there, to solve business problems, that there's not a lot of bridging there. So we want to support the people who are not full-time developers, who are not necessarily writing code, though may certainly write some code. Citizen developers often do, as do information architects in the course of their work. And it's sort of a space, again, that's sort of in the middle. We have lots of end-user documentation, we've got lots of developer documentation, but we don't have that middle ground covered as well. We want to make sure that we do look at across Microsoft 365 products and services. So It's interesting. We're looking for interesting ways that people have brought together these services in order to solve business problems in a real sense, not necessarily a hypothetical sense. It's one thing to come up with a what if and wouldn't this be wonderful white paper or something, but we really want to try to collect some real stories, even if they're camouflaged quite well, about how people have solved real problems. We also want to give people who don't have a blog that's been followed for a long time, or don't feel that they have a place to sort of let their knowledge be known, a place to publish. And this repository is a place where you can publish that, I like to think of it as having a very long tail. So for example, if someone has a blog post that has gotten some interest and is still valid a year later and is still useful a year later, it might be languishing a little bit. Moving some of that content into the Microsoft 365 community docs is a way to give it a longer life, as well as ongoing revisions and ongoing sort of review, so that it becomes a living document. It's not something that just sits there statically and goes out of date like so many things do on I know on my blog. I certainly don't go back and read a lot of those posts and edit them and fix them for new information. They sort of stand static after I write them. So we're gonna sort of talk a little bit more about what it is, and then we'll take a look at what's actually there. So what are some of the driving ideas here? And I've mentioned some of them, but why is this all a good idea? One of the things that is absolutely true is that people outside the offices in Redmond or Oslo or wherever it is that Microsoft 365 people sit, outside those hallowed halls, we all solve problems in a different way. We sometimes look at these services and think, I wonder if this would work. And we come up with solutions that no one predicted. Or we think about them in sort of in relative importance that's very different than the product groups. And that's actually a good thing, because it means we're actually coming up with ways to use the products well to solve our problems. We do find ways to make things work, whether it's the intended use or not. I've seen this going all the way back to SharePoint 2007 at least, if not back to DBase in the old days, where people come up with solutions that you just sort of think, I never would have thought about that, but that certainly solves that problem really well. We tend to work with the services together in different ways than Microsoft may have predicted. We didn't build the products, so we don't have the same biases. We don't think of Planner as a Kanban tool that's used by software development teams. We look at it as something that may solve a whole plethora of problems that Microsoft may never have thought about. And we struggle with different aspects of using the platform than people inside Microsoft might ever expect. Things that an engineer who has worked on a part of the product for years thinks is really easy may be something that we really have a lot of trouble with, or a technical barrier that we that we run into all the time, or a limitation in what part of the product does that people in Redmond don't necessarily know about. So basically all these bullets are about the fact that people out here in the community have ideas and ways to solve problems and voices that aren't always the same as what we hear from Microsoft. And that's a good thing. That's not something that should be scary to us or to Microsoft. So what are the topic areas? Oh wait, there's some walruses. Walruses are really cool, aren't they? So we have some basic groupings of content so far. Really with an open source repository like this, the content itself is what drives that information architecture. It drives how we group things and where we have focus areas and things like that. But there are some things that the content we have so far falls into. There's some basics and definitions, and as simple as a glossary, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Concepts around information architecture. Always something that people struggle with inside an organization. How do you build things out well so that you can be as effective as possible? How do you automate things where it makes sense and where it doesn't? Or not automate things where it doesn't? Microsoft 365 better practices. I used to be a big best practices person, and I've learned over the years that there's no such thing as a best practice, but there are better practices that you can choose from depending on your situation, because as we know, it all depends. How can we make better decisions? In many cases, how you decide how to use services or how to implement them is almost like a decision tree. It's not always that cut and dry, but there's a set of criteria that you can use in order to make better decisions about how you solve problems. And we want to try and capture some of those better decision ideas, and hopefully mostly in terms of some scenarios. How do we describe some scenarios that can help you get to a better decision-making point? Some SharePoint better practices. Like I said, I'm a SharePoint guy from way back, so of course there's some contents focused specifically on SharePoint. I expect that we'll see some content specifically focused on some other services in themselves as well. But again, we're trying to find things that cover more areas more broadly. And then some, like I said, some useful scenarios, which may or may not be part of me making better decisions. But, you know, here's how you think about setting up a list to solve this particular problem, for example, might be a scenario that would be helpful. We've had some great contributions to date. This is one of those for love and country kind of efforts. You know, it's an open source thing. Having been involved with some open source efforts in the past, I realized a long time ago that what open source means is that a small number of people do a lot of work, and most people take that work and use it. And that's okay. That's really how it works. So far, we've gotten a pretty good group of people who have made contributions to this repository, and I expect that we'll see a lot more people on this list over time. We want to be sure that we give people credit. We're going to announce their names on regular P&P community calls. We're going to make sure their names are up in lights like this. I'm not going to read all of those because the list is getting sort of long, but you know, these folks have given their own time and effort in order to write content to share with all of you so that you can be better practitioners in the community. We also have some great support from people at Microsoft. We're tied closely to the group that works with docs.microsoft.com, and in fact that's where the Microsoft 365 community content is housed. So it is created and managed in GitHub, and I'll talk about that a little bit, and then is published to docs.microsoft.com. And these folks have been very instrumental in helping us get all of that process and sort of scaffolding up and running, and running some interference with us with people who had questions or doubts about whether this was a good idea. And there's some walruses, because everyone loves walruses. So that's enough slides. Let's take a second and go through, or a few minutes, and go through what the repository looks like, how it's structured, how you might be able to contribute or learn from it. Here we are in the Microsoft 365 community content area. Notice that this is in the docs.microsoft.com area, hosted by Microsoft. And again, everything in this repository is generated by the community for the community. So even though it lives in a sanctioned Microsoft Docs area, it's all based on work that we have done out here in the community. The navigation is very straightforward, and probably will get more complicated over time, hopefully, because we're going to have lots of content to show. But what we have in general is the content areas that I mentioned, things like basics and definitions, Microsoft 365 better practices, etc. And within each one of these, we've highlighted certain articles which we think have broad appeal. So this page will probably change over time as the amount of content grows. The navigation on the left side mirrors what's in those blocks, but will probably end up being much larger than what we highlight in the blocks to start with. But let's talk about basics and definitions, sort of a getting started. I know that when people use acronyms and abbreviations, it drives me a little bit batty because half the time I never know what people are talking about. So the first thing that we wanted to do in this repository is have a glossary. So here are some things that people are likely to say if you're working in the Microsoft 365 space, and what it means. And many of these entries here will refer back to an article or another doc in the Microsoft Docs area, and help you sort of get a starting point about a particular topic. If there are terms that you've struggled with or you think that other people need to understand better, please let us know. You can come to the GitHub repository and create an issue, and I'll talk a little bit about why that word issue isn't necessarily the best one for the way this works, but it does work. And add some content just for a quick definition like this. And we'd be happy to fold it in. So the content here is everything from that, which is a very simple entry in a glossary. So, this is a piece of content that someone contributed. I think that one might have been me. To short articles, things like what is a site column? Something in SharePoint that a lot of people don't understand all that well. There are some articles from Microsoft, but this is an attempt, and this is also one that I wrote, an attempt to explain what a site column is in the context of a real-world example, something that we all understand, which is writing checks. Though I know that people write checks in the US far more often than in the rest of the world. And then some connection to how that plays out in a work sense. So that's a relatively short article that just introduces a concept. Same thing with what is a content type. But some of these articles actually get much more detailed. So for instance, Sue Hanley contributed a great article that she had written elsewhere, that helps you understand, should I use a team site or a communication site? And what are my criteria to try to make that decision? And this is a great article that I know has gotten quite a bit of reading because it's a tough decision to make, especially if you're new to the platform. So definitely, if you know new people who are coming to the ecosystem and they need to learn about some of this stuff from a standing start, some of these articles are going to be very helpful for them. List columns or site columns, which one should I choose? Can we use machine learning to assign managed metadata attributes for items? So you see some of these are very detailed, some of them are more broad. Some things in information architecture. How do we think about site topology? How do we think about managed metadata versus lookup columns? Again, all sort of positioned in such a way that it helps you make either better decisions or build better solutions. So this is sort of the front end of the whole thing. This is how you come to the Microsoft 365 community docs to consume the content. And please do that. The URL is hopefully not too hard to forget. It's aka.ms/m365 community docs. And that will bring you right here. If you are interested in contributing, or you have a question or a suggestion about a particular article, like this one about known folder move, you can at the bottom give us some feedback. So you can submit some feedback by entering it into this form. This form is actually at GitHub in the repo that sits behind this whole thing. You'll see that there's a bunch of information here that's a little confusing to look at, but you don't have to worry about it. You can just enter your feedback here, give it a title, give your feedback, and then submit new issue. Again, issue is the sort of the currency in GitHub. You raise an issue, you create an issue. When you have a question, you have a suggestion, or anything that you might need to interact with the people who manage the repo. Issue doesn't have to be something that's wrong. It can be a contribution or a suggestion. The other way you can sort of interact with this on a very simple level, and you would see the feedback from other people here if there were any on this article so far. We can also click on Edit article that sits in the GitHub repo behind this docs.microsoft.com repository. So this is where we manage the content, where we keep track of people who are working on things and draft content, and then we decide when we want to publish that content out to the docs.microsoft.com repo. Now you'll notice that when I landed here this time, I have logged out of GitHub. So if you want to interact with the content, you need to have a GitHub account. You'll notice that this little pencil is grayed out. I must be signed in to make or propose changes. So if I sign up, it's a painless process. You give it your first name and last name, I believe, and just create a handle, sort of like signing up for Twitter. Make sure that you create a nice profile for yourself, because hopefully you'll be an ongoing author and will want to look you up and know who you are and give you credit for what you're doing. Otherwise, you can just sign in with the existing account that you may have. And you notice that I'm using 1Password, so that was relatively painless, even though there was a multi-factor authentication. So now I'm logged in, and I can actually click on this pencil and make edits to this particular article. And if I decide that I want to I don't know, let's say I want to fix the spelling of something, or I want to get rid of that space. Actually, there was a space at the end of that line that really has been bothering me. So I can fix the space. I just make a comment about what I've done, and I say commit changes. That was pretty painless. So that's what we do in order to edit something. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a template for what we call a pull request. When you make a change and you ask that it be included in the repo, it's called a pull request. And this just gives you some ways to sort of frame the change that you've made, so that we know how to accept it and how to merge it in with the other fixes or the other content in the repository. So I'm actually not going to create this, but you can read these instructions. Some things say delete this paragraph after reading. I wrote most of this, and I know it's a little bit deep to get into, but it's actually not as bad as it looks. So that's how we make a change to an existing article, just using that edit link when we're reading the article in the end repository, which is here. Okay, so again, this is an open source effort. Anyone can become an author or a contributor just by clicking that edit button, which takes you into GitHub, into that particular article, and you can make corrections or suggestions if you have them. The other thing that you can do is actually create new content that doesn't exist yet, and we would love it if you would do that. So there are a couple things that you can read if you would like to sort of cross that threshold. If you scroll down past the so-called code here, you'll see the README. And this README is hopefully, ideally, useful to you and understandable, even if you've never used GitHub before. So it sort of explains what it is. It gives you some options about where you might go next based on what you want to do. If you don't know what GitHub is, go and read Getting Started. We have a wiki here that has a few articles. I'd like to make it a little richer, that explain how to do things, how to become a contributor, how you can become a valuable member of this little community of documentation. So feel free to read that information and make suggestions if you don't understand it. If you need to, if you want to contribute, or you want to say something and you just don't feel comfortable with GitHub, feel free to use the M365 ComDocs Twitter account to talk to us admins, and we'll get back to you from there. Or just create an issue, which might be a little bit more work, but is probably going to give you more value. One of the things that's important here is that when you create a new issue, you have a choice of different types of things that you would like to say. And these options may expand over time, but it's sort of the basic stuff. There's an article issue. There's a bug with some content. You have an article suggestion. I would love to know more about X. I think it would be fantastic if someone could explain why. Or you just have a question. I don't understand how this repo works. Could you explain to me? Whatever it is. And report a security vulnerability, which is probably never going to happen in this repo. So it's all pretty straightforward. It looks complicated, but it really doesn't have to be. If you have some content or you'd like to be a contributor and would like to write some content, we're happy to buddy you up with someone who understands the infrastructure better and either teach you how it all works or just publish the content for you. Ideally, you'll publish the content yourself so that you can get your name in lights. You can, show up in that docs.microsoft.com repo and have credit for the content that you've created. So that's it. A quick review of what the Microsoft 365 Community Docs are, where they are, how they work, and hopefully some ideas that might help you get involved. Really, we would love to have you contribute in any way that you possibly could, or just read the documents that are there and hopefully get something valuable out of them. There are a couple of links here that might be useful. Here's that aka.ms/m365-community docs short link from Microsoft that takes us to that public-facing docs.microsoft.com repo. I've also set up a Microsoft Forms form where we can gather feedback if you aren't comfortable with any of the other mechanisms. It just asks you for your name, your email address, and what you'd like to say. If you'd like to get in touch, please feel free to use that link. It's just a short link that'll take you to the Microsoft Forms form. Well, that's about it. It's a short session, so thank you very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it. If you have questions, you can use that form from the previous screen. You can certainly tweet at me at @simpmarc or visit my website where there's a contact form. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. I know that maybe my microphone sounded like I'm down in the engine room where I'm sitting today, but it's fun looking after the spaceship and making sure that we're all getting to that next planet safe and sound with the best knowledge and collaborative tools at our disposal. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.